Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to ask you please to sit down now. We're going to start the next panel. Thank you all for being here today. I'm honored to be the moderator of today's panel that will talk about public policy and institutional design. During the next 60 minutes, we'll talk about the impact and the role of regulation and public policy in Brazil. And to discuss this important topic, I'd like to introduce to you our panelists today. Our first panel member is Judge Bruno Bodart. He is a judge in Rio de Janeiro, and he clerked for Justice Luiz Fux at the Supreme Court of Brazil. He also holds a master's degree from the Rio de Janeiro State University, and he served as a director of the Brazilian Law and Economics Association. And last but not least, he's also my dear friend and colleague of the LLM program of Harvard Law School. Our second panelist is Eduardo Mendonça. Eduardo is a professor of constitutional law at UniCeub in Brasília. He has a JD from the State University of Rio de Janeiro with a visiting period at the Humboldt University of Berlin. He's also a lawyer with vast experience in arguing before Superior Court of Justice and the Supreme Court of Brazil. In terms of panel dynamics, I'll ask each of our panelists to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for audience questions. And for that, I'll ask you please submit questions through the Slido app by using the hashtag HarvardLawBrazil. So let's kick off with our first panelist, Judge Bruno Bodart.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm very honored that you all are attending this meeting, and especially because I have two good friends here sharing this panel with me, Professor Eduardo and Raissa. And today I'm going to speak about regulatory impact analysis. A preliminary question here is, after all, what is regulation? I'm using a very broad, very general sense because economists said that regulations are the various forms of government action that limit behavior in order to fix what they call market failures. We know that regulation in Brazil is excessive and is of very low quality. From October 1988 to September 2016, Brazil enacted 5,047,988 pieces of legislation, considering acts from the legislature and the executive in the federal, state, and local levels. We live in a world in which we wake up on a bed that follows certain mandated specifications. You drink a coffee that meets some quality standards. You turn on the TV and the content is regulated. And the TV itself is a very regulated device. You drive a car that satisfies numerous quality requirements and is produced by a subsidized industry. And the same may be said about the gasoline you use in your car. Then you go to work, where your labor conditions are subject to regulation, and you pay taxes all along the way. So why is our life so highly regulated? Because economists said that if the world was ideal, so under some unrealistic assumptions, even in the absence of government intervention, we will have the perfect allocation of resources in a society. This is the first theorem of welfare economics. So, and if government intervenes in this scenario, government will create what they call deadweight loss. So, there are some justifications for regulation, and all of them are just the idea that life isn't perfect. We have failures that they call informational asymmetry. You really don't know what's happening, so you can make your own judgment about the transaction. So we have the problem of externalities. For example, when you buy your car, the price that you pay may not reflect the pollution your car generates and harm other people that are not involved in this transaction. We have non-competitive behavior, which is the situation in which an agent, when transacting in the market, influences the price, and then the price itself may not reflect the best allocation of resources. And we also have what psychologists brought to economics, which are the behavioral biases. So these are all factors that might suggest that there's a failure in the market and the overall allocation of resources will not be perfect. But what about the failures of regulation? Because we know that government itself is not perfect. So Professor Daro Masemoglu, which is a professor at MIT, he says that it is difficult to ensure that government and the politicians entrusted with the allocation of resources do not use their power to their own benefits, which is what some economists call rent-seeking. So another problem is that collecting information is costly. In order to design good regulation, policymakers must have good data. They must have good information. And this is very costly, and it is unlikely that they can perform their tasks perfectly in all cases. So a last point is what Professor Richard Posner, which is a professor at Chicago Law School, what he calls taxation by regulation. In order to achieve a given goal, the government can either directly fix the problem, and it will fund itself with the money from taxpayers, from all of us, or the government can use regulation to compel you to do that task. And then government doesn't need to use your money because you use your own money to make that measure that government deems is desirable. So when government, we've seen Professor Glaser talk about urban regulation. So urban land use regulations are an example of this. The government could buy your building, but instead it prohibits you from adding floors by using zoning regulation. And the problem is that taxation is usually well perceived by the taxpayers. So you get angry when you know that taxes will be raised. And the power to levy taxes is often limited. On the other hand, regulating is free for the government, and often it is misperceived by people. You don't even know how many obligations you have due to regulation. So now I'm going to add some examples, some problems with the most common techniques used to address the market failures. First, mandatory disclosure. Poorly designed disclosure requirements may cause many different problems. First, information that does not generate any meaningful benefit. In Brazil, our FDA, which is called Anvisa, requires egg cartons to show the message, allergic, contains eggs. Well, that's what you expect when you buy egg. So why in the world we have this kind of mandatory disclosure? Second, the policy may be based on unwarranted findings or beliefs. For example, here 80% of Americans support mandated disclosure that this product contains DNA. Well, the problem is that this statement makes no sense at all because everything contains DNA. So what's the point in have this kind of regulation? That may cause confusion. Another example, which is more serious, has to do with the genetically modified organisms. There is no scientific evidence at all that GMOs cause any threat to our health, as the OMS, the FDA, and other important institutions have said in the past decades. A study from 2013 has shown that consumers, on average, are willing to pay 14% less for GMO products when they see in the package this warning that the product contains GMOs. So disclosure here aggravates a consumer misperception because consumers draw the false inference that if there's a warning, there must be something wrong with that product. Another problem is information overload. Human capacity to capture and process information is limited. Excessive disclosure distracts consumers and prevents them from considering important aspects of their decision. Unnecessary disclosure can cause confusion, even when it is true. For example, let's suppose that due to an organic labeling requirement, packages must display that this product was made from animal feces. Well, this is true. Organic products are, in fact, made from animal feces, but this is an unnecessary stigma to the product. People may not buy it, even when it is desirable, just because of that warning. The conclusion is that mandated disclosure must be well designed to serve its purposes. There's a study from 2010 saying that mandated warning that past returns do not guarantee future performance for retail investments has no impact on these investors' decision making. However, a more extensive warning that past returns usually do not persist, that did have an effect on the investor's decision. So you have to design very carefully mandated disclosure to achieve the results in society that you are looking for. Another kind of, very common kind of regulation is the one about quality standards. And the success of this approach depends heavily on the amount of information that policymakers have about all the aspects of the product and the desires of consumers. So, first example, bundling. Regulation in Brazil, there's, I think this is not working. Okay, it's here. So, there's some states have, by statute, the requirement that supermarkets have must have grocery packers. So you go to the market, and there must be someone there helping you to pack your groceries. So what if most consumers would rather pay a lower price and pack their own groceries? Why should the government here interfere with what you deem necessary for yourself? The Supreme Court of Brazil, in fact, has ruled this kind of statute, this kind of regulation, unconstitutional. And it can also lead to undesired consequences, this kind of approach. A study that was conducted in 1975 has shown that requiring seatbelts made drivers feel safer and therefore drive faster. The result was that regulation, in fact, reduced driver mortality, but on the other hand, it increased pedestrian mortality. So in the end, it is unclear if this kind of regulation was really desirable. Another kind of regulation has to do with air quality controls. A study from 1982 has shown that air quality controls on vehicles increased air pollution in the first years after the regulation was introduced. The thing is that as prices went up due to the higher quality standards, consumers just postponed buying new cars, which were the cars that had like better, that were more environmental friendly. So, by seeing everything, there's the question: how can we prevent these kinds of undesirable regulation? And there are many answers to this question, but I'd like to offer one for our country, that is the regulatory impact analysis. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a strong movement for deregulation influenced reforms all around the globe. Here in the US, President Ronald Reagan introduced in 1981 the requirement of a cost-benefit analysis preceding new regulations in the Federal Administration of the United States. The CBA requirement has been maintained by every administration since it was created, whether Republican or Democrat. Similar initiatives have spread across developed nations, such as the United Kingdom, Germany, the Netherlands, Australia, and Canada. In many of these countries, the regulatory impact assessment considers only some of the costs. For example, in the UK, the RIA focuses on burdens on business and enforcement expenses. So it's just a part of the problem that is considered, but at least they have some kind of regulatory impact analysis. So I want to focus now on CBA in the US. How does it work? So there's a department here in the federal government called OIRA, which is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, in charge of overseeing the CBA produced by the other agencies. For example, if there's a proposal of regulation to require a certain safety precaution in the oil industry to prevent spills, the costs of this kind of regulation will be the price of the equipment times the number of companies affected by this measure. On the other hand, the benefits will be the avoided environmental impacts, such as the contamination of the water or the killing of animals, plus the avoided losses to third parties like fishermen and the tourism industry, adjusted by the reduction in the probability of an oil spill. And then regulation is adopted if and only if its benefits outweigh its costs. So, in this sense, everything is quantified under a single measurement unit, most commonly dollars or any monetary unit. And in some contexts, the costs and the benefits are not quantified, but only listed and vaguely evaluated. That's what Professor Howell Jackson talked about on Tuesday. So the various levels of CBA. And here in the US, they use the most rigorous way, which is to monetize all the costs and benefits, even the intangible ones. For example, if a given regulation would reduce the likelihood of an accident, the policymaker must consider the so-called value of a statistical life. But how do we elicit these values? The answer is by assessing the so-called willingness to pay. It is the willingness to pay of the group under analysis which will determine the result of the CBA. And there are two general methods of doing this. The first one is called revealed preferences. We observe how people decide when they are faced with real-world situations with the choice between two different goods. This is also called market valuation. For example, using econometric techniques, it is possible to isolate how much more you are willing to pay for housing located in a less polluted neighborhood. So the government is able to know, to assess how much you value living in a less polluted environment. The other method for doing this is called stated preferences. The government conducts surveys to ask citizens their valuation of non-market resources, and this is also called contingent valuation. There's a huge debate around the reliability of contingent valuation, but I'll skip over it and move forward to the main criticisms to CBA. The main criticism is a paper by Professor Bruce Ackerman from Yale Law School, which is called Pricing the Priceless. So Professor Bruce Ackerman says that you can't put a price on life, you can't put a price on intangible values. So it is impossible to do CBA because it is arbitrary and it is immoral to put a price on such intangible values. But in my opinion, this is a strawman fallacy. The price here is just a proxy of how people value a given good. We make decisions that involve intangible values in our everyday lives. When you decide to buy a car with only basic safety features, you are increasing the risks. You are increasing the risks of a fatal accident because you don't want to sacrifice your present utility, which is the premium that you pay when you have a better car. In the US, the value of a statistical life is based on studies of wage premiums of dangerous jobs. So if you choose to work in a more dangerous job, you are actually putting a price on the risk that you're gonna die or that you're going to have a very bad disease. This price, the statistical value of life is now around $7 million. Some real difficulties of conducting CBA are, first, information about the costs and benefits is really costly to obtain. I remember that a CBA in New York about the desirability of banning Uber and car sharing services from the city costed like $2.5 million, just the study about the desirability of Uber. And also another difficulty is that it's hard to predict the progress of technology, which may, in fact, in the future, reduce costs. Sometimes there's a question about how to frame a cost or a benefit. For example, we're talking about the value of a statistical life. Should a statistical life be worth more the younger the person is? So if you're old, you have only 1 or 2 or 3 years left in your life. Should your life be worth less than the life of a child? Another problem is, should we consider the way in which the person died? Is it worth more to die a better death? So these are some ethical problems in conducting a CBA. Another problem, which kinds of interests are legitimate in CBA? For example, in the CBA of a program to promote the access to the water for poor communities in Haiti, it was detected that men had negative willingness to pay for the time their spouses used to spend in going to a water well far away from home. Should we consider this interest of men to have their women out of home for that period? So this is another ethical question here. Another problem, willingness to pay is distorted by inequality. So, of course, the poor have less willingness to pay for some goods than the rich. Also, who has standing in this question? Should benefits to other communities, states, or even countries be considered in CBA? There are also intergenerational problems. How much should we sacrifice from current consumption to bequeath to the next generations? But notice that many of these difficulties persist even when CBA is not adopted. The thing is that we just ignore all these problems because we tend not to think analytically about regulatory issues. In Brazil, we use the test of proportionality, which is just a rudimentary way, an inconsistent way of doing CBA. But I also wanted to stress the advantages of CBA. It reduces rent seeking. It reduces abuse of regulatory power, although some commentators affirm that CBA is manipulable. Another benefit of CBA is that it increases transparency and forces regulators to review some assumptions. But here too, some commentators complain that the complexity of CBA actually hinders transparency. A third advantage of CBA is that it compels policymakers to be consistent across different regulations. And finally, it increases democratic participation because the will of the people is taken into account when regulation is designed. So, thank you all for your time, and I'm open to whatever questions you may have.
Thank you, Judge Bruno, for this enlightening talk. We'll now turn to our next panelist, Eduardo Mendonça.
Good afternoon. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank my dear friend Bruno, who invited me to be here. For anyone who studies constitutional law, who tries to teach constitutional law, it's a special moment to be here at Harvard, but it's also a bit intimidating. It was intimidating when they called me, and I didn't even know that there would be a lecture like this one we had today from Professor Glaser. So my will is to go away. And they didn't tell me that my dear friend Bruno would, in 20 minutes, wrap up so much content and do a so beautiful PowerPoint presentation. I'm feeling ashamed of mine, which is very simple, as you will see. But I'm less ambitious here. I'll try to make a point in these 20 minutes. I'll try to make a point about a problem that I think is crucial to how we see economic freedom in Brazil. The main theme of this symposium is institutions drive progress. So I chose an aspect, and I intend to discuss how economic freedom in Brazil is applied by the different spheres of power responsible for regulating, in a broad sense, private actors, private activities. What I'll try to demonstrate, at least to make some examples, is how economic freedom in Brazil is frequently used as a rhetorical ornament. It's not real. It does not grant people the real power to do what they want. If there's a legislator who has had a good idea, has a good intention, and he thinks that his good intention is enough to pass a lot of requirements into private activity. So I'll try to demonstrate that this rhetorical character is not due to constitutional provisions. In effect, there's a clear detachment between what the Constitution says in this matter and our practice, the behavior of our authorities. In effect, the Constitution proclaims, I have few slides, so I have to be very economical with them. Constitution proclaims that free enterprise is not only a general principle of constitutional regulation of the economy, but also a fundamental right and one of the foundations of the Republic, alongside with the principle of human dignity, citizenship, and a few others. I know that the majority of you are Brazilian judges, and it's also an honor to talk to a public like this. And I know that you know most of what I'm going to say, but I'll try to put this in a different light. So that's the only ambition I have here. So there is a constitutional commitment to a model of free market and a disbelief in state paternalism. And the Constitution says explicitly that the state planning for the private sector can only be a recommendation. It can only be indicative, not mandatory. Despite this, in practice, state intervention in free enterprise is absolutely trivialized. Authorities from the three branches of power feel comfortable to impose their preferences and hunches without pointing to empirical evidence that could justify their positions. CBA, as explained by Bruno, would be an advance. A real CBA would be an advance in Brazil. And these policies have no attention, no real attention, to the consequences that they produce in real life. You never know when a local lawmaker will wake up with a great new idea and change everything for you who is trying to do business. That's a huge problem for us. And the consequences of this are very clear. In spite of what the Constitution says, in spite of the power of Brazilian economy, Brazil holds the last positions in all available rankings of economical freedom. According to the World Bank, Brazil is the fourth country in which it takes longer to open a company. We are rivalizing with sub-Saharan Africa, Venezuela. It's not where we should be. And so on. Almost all indicators suggest a general posture of mistrust against free enterprise. And so do the examples that I would like to highlight. I start with the legislative branch. Here, as you know, we have a particular problem, that is that all the constitution, all the federative entities are allowed to legislate on economic law. It means the federal union, the 27 states, to simplify, and the more than 5,500 municipalities. So we have more than 5,000 legislators issuing restrictions upon economical activity. There's certain parameters to allocate the power to legislate among them, but there's a huge overlap, and we know that it facilitates arbitrary intervention. When it comes to the federal legislature, I'd like to give an example which is very powerful in my opinion. There's a very broad policy in Brazil due to federal legislation, a very broad policy for compulsory discounts in cinemas, theaters, and other cultural attractions, even when these activities do not receive any specific state subsidy. The federal government, the federal legislation, grants a discount of 50% in the ticket prices to all the students of any age and of any level, including graduate students and postgraduate students, to any person with disability. And according to the law, this person can take a companion with her, which also will have the same discount. To all customers between 15 years old and 29 years old who are enrolled in a welfare program, which a lot of people in Brazil. As expected, this system created a widely recognized distortion. Fraud is pervasive, everybody knows that, and the prices went up for all the customers. So instead of correcting a market failure, regulation generated the market failure in Brazil regarding this issue. And I'll come back to this issue because movie theaters seem to be an obsession for this kind of arbitrary intervention. I'll give another example now concerning the local legislative power. Again, with the movies. As I told you, it seems to be an obsession. State laws, local laws, establish a lot of new discount rules for several categories. One of the most emblematic, established in states such as Espírito Santo and Paraná, is for blood donors. It is to say, the government wants to stimulate a certain conduct to donate blood, which is understandable and positive, but to do so forces a private company to grant discounts at its services. It would be something like this. You go donate blood and then you get a voucher for Amazon. And Amazon has to pay for the good action that government wants to stimulate. We have more. There is also state laws that prohibit shopping centers, shopping malls, for charging for the use of parking lots if the customer has bought something. Supreme Court recently has struck down legislation like this, but mainly because of competence reasons, not because of the violation of economic liberty. There's also the requirement, also already mentioned by Bruno, that supermarkets hire employees to pack groceries for the customers, which doesn't make any sense. And fortunately, it was struck down by the Supreme Court recently. So when it comes to state laws and the legislation of municipalities, anything absurd as it is has already happened. You can believe me. Those of you who live in Brazil don't need to believe me. Probably you know that for yourselves. I give you now an example of the executive branch. It has to do with the regulation of ports. When it comes to this, Brazil has some of the worst indicators in the world. We are rivalizing with Venezuela once again. And it's very sad. And our indicators are well worse than those of countries with economies like ours, in the same degree of development like ours. In the 90s, the federal legislature has passed a bill trying to change this reality, or at least it was the set goal of this new bill. And one of the main focus was to enhance competition. And to do that, it was allowed that huge companies, big companies who own private ports could use the exceeding capacity of these ports to sell the service to other companies. And then by a decree from the president, a presidential decree, it was said that this exceeding capacity could only be used as in an eventual basis. So the idea was to enhance enhance competition. We allowed ports to use their exceeding capacity to enhance competition, and then the government says that you can't do that in a regular basis, only eventually. And of course, it has to do with corporate interests that are very powerful in this sector. Now I go to the judiciary branch, and this is sensible because I'm talking to judges, and I'm going to say at the end that the judiciary has an important role to perform here. The courts in Brazil, especially local courts, have been systematically upholding this kind of legislation, this kind of arbitrary regulation. In some cases, courts aggravate more than just uphold the arbitrary regulation. I'll give you 2 examples and then I'll move on. Several courts, including the Superior Court, which is responsible for standardizing interpretation of federal law, decided that airlines could not apply limits for compensation for loss of luggage. Of course, when the customer decides not to declare his luggage, and therefore you need to make some kind of assumption to define what compensation will be due. And this was decided by the courts in spite of the fact that Brazil is a signatory of Warsaw Convention, which dictates that some prefixed limits must be applied. This kind of policy was reversed recently by the Supreme Court, but for more than 10 or 20 years, this was the policy that was being applied in Brazil due to judiciary regulation, as a matter of fact. I give you another example. And I forgot to use this, so this was about the discounts in movie theaters. It's an excerpt of the decision, and I'll talk about this now. Another example. The Superior Court of Justice decided that retail stores cannot give discounts for customers who pay with cash, in comparison to those who use credit cards. The justification is to avoid what would be an unjustified distinction between customers. But the effect of this is obvious. The administrative costs, the administrative fees charged by credit card operators will have to be shared by all customers. And the burden, the main burden of this will be put on those customers who are poor, who don't have credit. So we are trying to protect customers, allowing the poor to pay for the rich. And this is a policy created by the judiciary branch. And I have one more example of this kind of judiciary intervention that is particularly sad. That law, that policy of discounts for blood donors, which I mentioned, was upheld by the Supreme Court. It's an old precedent from 2006 2006 is Brazil is ancient history. Things change daily, as you know. For the Supreme Court, 2006 would be very recent. But for us, it's like ancient Greece. But in 2006, the Supreme Court said that it was okay, there was no violation of economic freedom when a state dictates that a theater, a movie theater, a private company has to grant discounts for those who have donated blood. I hope this is changed soon. Well, now I conclude with what I wanted to say to you judges. We need the judiciary to be part of the solution, and it has been so far part of the problem. To use a provocative comparison, we need a mild Lochner era. In a way that we need to reaffirm the effective character of economic freedom, blocking capricious interventions deprived of any evidence and evaluation of impacts on the reality. Professor Adrian Vermeule from this Harvard Law School published a thought-provoking book called Law's Abnegation. In it, he says that Congress usually grants relevant leeway for agencies to regulate, and that in a context that situation, in a context of increasing uncertainty, the judiciary began to adopt a general posture of deference to legislative and administrative decisions. In a certain manner, this deference was built throughout the years, strengthened by the general requirement that regulatory decisions survive minimal tests of rationality and presentation of evidence. Professor Vermeule concludes, and I put a small subset of his work, that the theory that demands a hard look would be inappropriate. But Brazil is not at the same moment as this theory says. We are in the last century in comparison. In our case, a look would be enough. We don't need the hard look, just a look. A look based on rationality would be enough. And I like to say that I'm not advocating for more general protagonism of the judiciary. I was not going to say this because I didn't know there were so many judges here. But even so, I'm not advocating for more general protagonism of the judiciary branch. What I'm saying is that we have to do what the Supreme Court has done along the last hundreds of years. We need to develop stable standards to review legislation and administrative action in order to give real content to economic freedom. This would serve also as a guideline for regulation. There are a very few cases in which the Supreme Court has struck down provisions based on the violation of economic freedom. And the opinions on these cases did not try to outline criteria. It's very case by case. We need a theory, we need a set of standards, a set of tests to give some content, some real content to economic freedom. Recently, Brazil lost a chance of creating a test, maybe our Chevron test. It was a case in which Professor Gustavo was involved, the case of Anvisa, which, as Bruno said, is our FDA, which had banned flavored cigarettes, all of them, including the ones with menthol. I know there's a similar discussion here in the US, but here in the US there was a bill passed by Congress who did establish some parameters, some criteria for the FDA to do this job. In Brazil there was no bill, it was an action taken by the agency and there was a tie, there was a draw in the Supreme Court, and we lost the chance to discuss, to establish a parameter for this kind of situation. Now I conclude really. Economic freedom in Brazil has been a theoretical ornament, something that has been generally invoked as a principle, but that does not seem effective in preventing authorities from all levels from imposing their hunches and good intentions on individuals, with no consideration for empirical data. We need to bring economic freedom closer to the true concept of fundamental right, which is a right that protects the individual, including and especially when the government says that they have good reasons to limit this freedom. So far, it's just something beautiful to say before the enactment of any restriction that the authority says would be good for society. That's part of our underdevelopment. That's part of how institutions can get better in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for your talk. It was great. Now, I think we have time for one more question. And the question is for you. Eduardo, I can help you. Thank you. I'm sorry. But I think also Judge Bruno can also jump in and answer it. And the question is, considering that the Brazilian Constitution provides for the principle of efficiency in administration, should we use it to require the government to conduct CBA? What do you guys think?
I think the right person to answer this is Bruno, but I'll try. Because I was nervous, I forgot to say, but Bruno is one of the is becoming a leading voice in Brazil concerning this matter, not only as a scholar but also as a judge. Bruno is too modest to say, but he was one of the first judges in Brazil to decide that Uber could not be banished just because someone thought that you can only transport people in your car when people want to be transported if you have a formal authorization, a formal license of the state. But I think that we have to introduce CBA in Brazil. We have something like this in the agency decision-making process. It's not always followed, but it's there. And I know there's a proposal to create something similar for the discussion in the legislative branch. I think it would be a huge advance in our decision-making process. But I think it's very difficult to impose such an advancement only based on the principle of efficiency. This is something that society has to get aware of, society has to adopt as a political decision. I don't think it can be imposed as a general derivation of the principle of efficiency. But Bruno can say much better than I.
Well, first, I'm flattered and also honored by your compliments, but I'll take them only because of our friendship, because they're exaggerated. Well, I think that the principle of efficiency can be just a general idea that we need some form of regulatory impact analysis. As I said, judges, in fact, already have this rudimentary form of CBA that is the proportionality principle, but judges must take into account the fact that they cannot use their own values, their own moral principles, and substitute them for the principles of the society. So, and this is the great lesson that we glean from CBA, that we need an objective and general framework to assess the social desirability of regulation, but we can't use only our own values. We have to see what people really think they deem useful and valuable for them. So, and I think that when we read this principle in the Constitution, we have to try to make it concrete but not only to what we think is desirable and necessary. We need to open the courts to the voices of the society.
And with that, we end our panel today. I would like to ask all of you to stay for the next panel that is going to talk about regulation as well, and it's going to start in a few minutes. Thank you all for coming.